So go back to 1994, and I was attending a church in Snohomish, and a gentleman came, a guest preacher came, and he started talking about this trip that he had taken to Russia to do mission work. And I had been a believer for 2 years at that point, but I was just really amazed by this story that this gentleman shared. He went to Siberia, I can't remember what city, and went to some prisons. And the neat thing about it is afterwards I got to meet him, and he gave me a Bible that was in English and in Russian. And so it was split, each page was split, and it had both languages in that. And at the time, I'd really been praying for God's will in my life. I'd really been seeking the Lord to really know what was God's purpose for me, because I became a believer like I said, just 2 years prior to that, when I was 24. So I was a bit older when I became a believer. And so Steve Schertzinger, he's gonna preach today. And he was the one that was there that day to share about his mission trip and all the things that God did through him in his journeys. And actually, that Bible started something for me, and I really started praying. And God ended up leading me to go to Russia as well to do mission work later. But God really used Steve as the first one to touch my heart and to go to Russia to do mission work. So it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Schertzinger.
So it's good to be with you folks today. If you happen to have a Bible, I'm going to encourage you to open that up to the Gospel of Matthew, the 5th chapter. It will not, you'll be able to read through this with me quite easily, because we're only going to look at one verse today. Matthew chapter 5, we're going to look at verse 13. Today, let me read that for you. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. Now, at the dinner table, when we talk about salt, what do we usually say? Anyone? Pass the salt, please, isn't it? If you're polite, you'll add please to it, right? Pass the salt, please, because for us, salt is, it's a food enhancer. That's what salt is for us. And so, but in the first century, in the ancient world, it wasn't a taste enhancer, it was a preservative. That was the purpose of salt. It wasn't to make food taste better. It was God's natural way of providing a refrigerator for food in the ancient world. In the ancient world, in fact, salt was extremely valuable. The Roman government would use salt to pay its soldiers. And if the Roman government was a little short on income, they would tax salt. Salt was that valuable in the first century. Imagine what went through the minds of those first century followers of Jesus Christ when he said, "You are the salt of the earth." Think about it. Think about what life was like for those early followers. Those early followers who had no standing in the world. They were an occupied country. They had no wealth, they had no political power, they had no economic power. And along comes Jesus and said, "You are the salt of the earth." And along comes Jesus and said, "You are valuable." The world didn't see them as being valuable. The culture didn't see them as being valuable. But Jesus would say, in the midst of their invalue, Jesus would say, "You are valuable. You are very valuable. In fact, you are earth preservers." Remember, that's the purpose of salt, was to preserve. Have you ever been given a nickname? Anybody here ever been given a nickname? What kind of a nickname did you get? Was it good? Yeah. Okay, what was your nickname? Mo. Called her Mo. What was your nickname? Yeah. No nickname. Who else had been given a nickname? I saw hands. Edge? Wow. Is that because you're edgy, or how did that work? Well, I was called Shorty. I was called Slinger. I was called Red. I was called Squirt. I was called a lot of different names. Some of them were not very polite, by the way, some of the nicknames people gave me. One of my longtime friends, when we lived in Upper East Tennessee was Tommy Oakes, a great man of God. Probably one of the finest communicators of the gospel I've ever heard. Very powerful, very powerful. And I was doing a retreat one time, or conference one time at a church camp. And I'd been off by myself, preparing, praying, getting ready for God's assignment for me that evening. And Tommy Oakes came up to me and he said, "Steve, I believe if God was choosing his 12 disciples, if Jesus was on earth choosing his 12 disciples today, I believe he would choose you to be one of them." That was a 30-second life changer. Steve, I believe if Jesus was choosing his 12 disciples today, he would choose you as one of them. That breathed life into me like no other statement has ever breathed into my life. Isn't that powerful? Absolutely motivating, challenging, encouraging. It was a defining moment for me. And yet that's exactly what Jesus was doing on that mountainside when he delivered the famous Sermon on the Mount. He said, you are salty, is what he's saying. You are valuable. You are a preserver for the world in which we live. He gave them a new name, a nickname. You know, God's done that all along. Remember in the Old Testament, Abram, what happened? God gave him a new name, and the new name was Abraham, because he'd be the father of many nations. He saw Simon, who was out just doing his own job, fishing. Jesus looked at him. "You're not Simon, you are Simon" what? Simon Peter. You are going to be a rock. You're going to be a strong, dependable person in my life. You'll be more than Simon. You'll also be a rock. So Jesus also gives his disciples. He gives you and me a new name, and he says, you are the salt of the earth. Wow. Not a food enhancer, not something to tickle your taste buds, but he said, you are valuable. He says, you are a preservative of the world in which we live. That is your assignment, and that is my assignment, to be a preservative for the world in which we live. Remember, they saw salt in an entirely different way than we do. Their culture valued salt, and Jesus Christ values you. You are the preserver of the entire planet. You know how decaying our world is in which we live, don't you? You know how tough it is. Here we had the recent Supreme Court ruling that redefined the word called marriage, that had stood the test of time for millennium, and redefined marriage so that it's not simply between a man and a woman, but now it's between a man and a woman and a woman. The world in which we live is under decay. But God has called you to be a preserver of the world in which we live. Here's a little truth. Salt always makes a difference. Salt always makes a difference, and a little bit of salt goes a long way. Can you say that with me? Salt always makes a difference, and a little bit of salt goes a long way. Again, salt always makes a difference, and a little bit of salt goes a long way. He says that's what you are. And that's what I am. That's what this church is to be about. We are to be reminders in the world that there is good and bad and right and wrong. Remember, these people, they didn't feel like they were salt. They didn't feel valuable. They were down low on the totem pole. The world had mostly rejected them. It was a country that had been conquered again and again by foreign armies. They were an occupied country. All of the power belonged to Rome, and that power that didn't belong to Rome was assumed by the scribes, the chief priests, and the Pharisees. They didn't feel like salt. They didn't see themselves as being salt. Nobody pays attention to them, and yet what does Jesus say? You are the salt. And salt always makes a difference, and a little bit of salt goes a long way. You see, many of the values that we take for granted today came from those early days of the Christian movement. We didn't create them. They were passed to us by previous generations, previous Christians who chose to be salt. And those values have stuck with us. What would our society be like if those values had disappeared? What would it be like? Well, just look at Iraq and Iran and you'll see what those values would be like. Where life is cheapened. You see, you and I are standards of a whole new way of thinking. Imagine what this world would be like if suddenly the idea of there being one God was taken away. Imagine what our world would be like if it was taken away that all men or women are created in the image of God and consequently have value. Imagine if that was taken away from our society. Go to Iraq and Iran and you will see that. Look at the killings in those countries, the burnings of live people, the beheadings done in the name of Allah. You see, we are recipients with a body of values. And if we don't take it and live it out, it'll disappear from the world in which we live. Disappear from the world in which we live. You think that our world is decaying today. Think what it would be like if we remove the salt, the preservative, you and me, from the world in which we live. I know you don't think you make much of a difference. But salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. Think what it would be like to live in a society where forgiveness, not revenge, were taken away. Think what it would be like to be in that kind of a society. What if the concept of forgiveness totally vanished from the earth? You see, forgiveness is not intuitive. Those of you who are moms and dads, you know that, don't you? You've watched your kids, haven't you? You know, they don't automatically go up and forgive each other, do the kids? They get in fights. They don't automatically forgive. And so what's mom tell Johnny to do? Or Eager to do? And they'll go give your brother a hug. Like he wants to give the brother a hug. He don't want to do that. Because forgiveness is not normal. It is not natural. It's not intuitive. It's part of the salt being passed down from generation to generation to generation. Where did that idea of forgiveness come? Forgive others and you will be forgiven. You've heard that, haven't you? Imagine a world where there's no forgiveness and where forgiveness is a weakness rather than a strength. You are the salt of the earth. And salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. Imagine a world in which the marriage covenant is no longer sacred. You see, it was a new concept under Jesus. Before Jesus, a woman was the possession of a man. A husband could do anything he wanted to with his wife. Go to Iran and Iraq, you would see that today. Imagine a world where that sacred marriage vow no longer exists. Why do we think that way? Why do we think that that's not the way you're supposed to behave? Husbands, why do we think that? It's because there were some salty Christians 2 millennia ago who chose to be the salt, who chose to be a preservative of the society in which they live. It all started when Jesus said, you must take a stand, and I promise you, it will make a difference. You are the salt of the earth. And salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. Imagine a world without forgiveness. Imagine a world where young children are used as sex slaves. Imagine a world if you own a slave, the slave is just a thing. Imagine a world where Christians choose to stay in the salt shaker rather than to go into the world. Imagine a world like that. Is that the kind of world you want to live in? You see, the world may be going down the tubes, it may be decaying, but as salty Christians, we slow that decaying process down. Imagine a world where no one objects to such atrocities. You see, we're called to be a thermostat, not a thermometer. Thermostat simply regulates the temperature, where a thermometer simply tells you what the temperature is. We are called to be salt, to make an impact in the direction of our world simply by our presence. But notice what he says. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. We're called to be salt. We're called to be effective in the world in which we live. You see, people in the first century primarily got their salt from marshes, kind of swampy areas that were impacted by salty waters. And they would take these branches, these reeds, this bark, anything, and they would take those home from the marsh, from the swampy area, and they would rub the reed or they rub the leaves on their meat. And when they did that, the salt off of these plants from the marshy areas, from the swampy areas, the salt would be rubbed into the meat. And thus the meat would be preserved, whether it was meat or fish or vegetables. You see, most of us are here today because we rubbed up against some salty Christians. Think about that. We're here because there was a salty Christian who got close enough to us that we began to be intrigued by these salty Christians. We may have found them to be irritating initially. You know, they said things that we didn't agree with. They said things that challenged the way we lived. They raised questions about the decisions that we made. They were salty Christians. And yet it caused us to pause and reevaluate life, to understand life. How did it happen? It happened because a preserving agent on assignment in your workplace, on the playground, in the classroom, over the backyard fence, someone you bought groceries or had your cars worked on, a preservative agent helped to preserve you. Could be a mom or dad or brother or sister, an aunt or uncle or grandma or grandpa. Maybe you worked on a card and maybe your card was worked on and a preservative agent preserved you. Maybe you're on the brink of making a bad decision and one of these agents, one of these salty Christians came along and said, I'm not sure I'd do that. And it changed the way you thought. Started out as an irritant. You see, they weren't changing the whole world, but they were helping to change the way you see the world. They were salty Christians. You see, salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. Mandy's taking a test and her friends keep texting her the right answers. Finally, Mandy texts back, please don't send me any more answers. It's not right. It's cheating. She's a reminder that there's a different way to see the world in which we live. She thinks that she won't really make a difference. But she will. Why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. It's like my friend Don. He's a sergeant with the Seattle Police Department. We get together regularly to pray and to read God's Word and to encourage one another. Each year, he and his police buddies go to Vancouver, British Columbia. They go up there to go drink it. It's kind of their weekend out, and they'll go drink at the bars. And after the bars, after eating together, they go to strip clubs. But Don doesn't go to strip clubs. He has a greater value and sensitivity to his wife, and he won't go there. Instead, he goes to his hotel room and spends the evening while the other officers are about. Don understands that he's accountable to his father. He's not preaching to his buddies. He's not telling them that it's wrong, but he's making a difference. They're watching him, trying to figure out what is different about Don. One of his buddies was going through a rough stretch with his wife. The other officers were encouraging him to just dump her and move on. Don was the only one who encouraged the marriage. And yet, it was Don that police officer turned to. Why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. And now that officer has begun attending North Shore Christian Church. Why? Because Don was salt. And salt always makes a difference. Granted, those officers may have made fun of him. They have told jokes about Don. But Don was making a difference because he's salt. And salt always makes a difference. Maybe you're the salt of the school in which you go to. You say, Pastor Steve, yeah, but I'm not making a difference. I'm not an athletic star. I'm not pretty. I'm not on the student council. I hardly understand the language as I struggle with a new language. I can't possibly be making a difference. But Jesus tells us that salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. You are making a difference, God says. You're the salt at Safeway. You're the salt at Sears. You're the salt of a construction company. You're the salt of the mortgage industry. You're the salt of Boeing. You're always making a difference whether you can see it or not. Because why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. If I'm the salt of the office, what does that look like? How do I be salt there? How do I be salt in my family? My neighborhood, my baseball team, or athletic club. And whether or not you're making a noticeable difference, you're always making a difference. Because salt always makes a difference. Jesus says about you, and 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 you. He says you're the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. You see, who we are today is because 21 centuries ago, a handful of powerless nobodies became the salt of the earth. A handful of powerless nobodies became the salt of the earth. And they took that assignment to the four corners of the world. And ultimately, Rome adopted many of those values that we cherish today. Why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. You see, in our country, we are the salt of the earth. In our businesses, we're the salt of the earth. In our classrooms, we're the salt of the earth. At Safeway, we are the salt of the earth. In our neighborhood, we are the salt of the earth. In our families, we are the salt of the earth. All we have to do is to make decisions in keeping with God's assignment to you and me to be the salt of the earth. And most of the time, we'll never see any changes. Never. But rest assured, all of the time, you are making a difference. Why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. I gave my life in a very real way when I was a student at Indiana University. By the way, that's where Annabelle and I met. I had 3 pagan roommates. We called ourselves Beta Theta Gorilla, apartment apes is what we called ourselves. And we'd throw kegers, drinking parties. After I became a Christian, I didn't really drink beer. I didn't like beer. I didn't like the taste of beer. I think it tasted a lot like llama spit, is what I thought of when I thought of beer. So I didn't really like that. But I still went to those parties even after I gave my life to Jesus. And I'd walk around with my Pepsi or my Coke, and I still socialized with those people. It was interesting, after Annabelle and I got married 42 years ago, wow, a long time ago, after we got married, we lived in student housing at the university. And it was this trailer court. There was like 400 trailers, and they all were painted the very same color. They were in the very same shape. The only thing, the difference was the number next to the door. And I would think that if you come home drunk, you could easily get into the wrong trailer because it wasn't obvious what your trailer was. And I remember one day I was taking the trash down to the place where they collect trash in the trailer park. And one of my roommates, we bumped into each other. And he started asking advice about marriage. He had displayed no interest in spiritual things at all for the 3 years that we lived together in the apartment. No interest whatsoever. Why did he ask me questions about his troubled marriage? Why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. That was one of those times I was privileged to see what salt had done. Most of the time, you'll never see that. You'll never see it. There won't even be a single clue. But our assignment is still the same. Our assignment is not dependent upon visible results that we get to see. Our assignment is the same. You're the salt. You are the salt. Yes? You are the salt. Yes? Dot? You are the salt. God says you are people of a great value. Not a people, you as an individual. You are of great value to God. God says, I have an assignment just for you. And your assignment is simply to be salt. You are making a difference. Even if you don't see it. You are making a difference. Why? Together? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long way. I know what some of us think. I'm only one person. What difference can I make? I can't sing. I can't play the keyboards. You did a great job up on the keyboards. I can't play the bongo. I have no rhythm, so you wouldn't want to follow me. I can't do that kind of stuff. You might say, well, I can't preach. I can't teach. My personality is such, I just want to be in the background. If people never notice me, I will be very happy. Our son Ben, he travels an awful lot when with his job. He travels to Cleveland, Ohio, of all places. He used to travel there every week for over a year. And what did Ben want for his travel? Do you remember? He wanted headphones so he could put those on, and so when nobody would talk to him. That's what he wanted. He didn't want to be interrupted. He didn't want to be bothered. And some of us are like that. Especially if you're new to our country and you struggle with our language. And you think, my English is terrible. Well, your English is much better than my Russian. Okay? People all the time ask me, do you speak Russian? And I tell them I know a little Russian. His name is Igor. He's about that tall. That's the little Russian I know. Yeah? I know what it's like to struggle with a language not nearly like you do. To have to exist on your own. I know some of you think, well, I'm not going to be making any difference. But I know differently. And God knows differently. Why? Because salt always makes a difference. And a little bit of salt goes a long, long, long. We're the salt of the earth. We've been entrusted with a powerful ministry and worldview. We've been given that concept of forgiveness. And this world would spoil much even more rapidly were it not for you and you and me. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the power of your word and the challenge to our life, the encouragement it is to our life. We're the kind of people, Lord, at least I am, that likes to see results. We like to see that I am making a difference in the here and now. And I'm making a difference that's measurable, observable. And I find encouragement from that. And yet you are using our lives, you're using my life in ways that we don't comprehend and can't even recognize. Thank you for your confidence in us, each of us, Lord. Thank you even in the midst of our shortcomings, in the midst of our underestimation of your role in our lives. Thank you for the assignment you have given us to be salt and light in a dark world. Thank you for those salty Christians who bumped up against us maybe decades ago, maybe a few years ago, maybe a few weeks ago, or a few days ago. Thank you for those salty Christians who allowed you to rub off of them and onto us. And yes, Lord, sometimes it was kind of irritating. Sometimes it was annoying. But thank you for bringing those irritating, annoying, salty Christians into our life. Thank you for preserving our lives and preserving those values that have stood the test of time. Stood the test of time. Oh, there are people who are here today who have used all kinds of excuses for not being a salty Christian. For some of us, being salt was pretty cool when we went on a Choose Life mission trip. But we struggle with that here and now in everyday life. Lord, I pray for my salty brothers and sisters. especially those who don't even know it. I pray for the release of your salt into their life and through their life. I thank you and give you praise for those blessed co-workers of these salty Christians who get to be around the salt of the earth. How fortunate and how blessed they are. Thank you for that assignment at the corner of the world where you have so much trust, so much confidence that you've sent us to. Each of us, Lord. The different corners of this world. Whether it's in our family or at work, it's in our recreation. We thank you for that assignment and that call on our lives. We thank you for your confidence in us. Help us, Lord, this week to take it even more seriously. To take the fact that we are the salt of the earth with greater confidence. And it's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.